Hey guys, you're listening to episode 103 of the Finish Line podcast, where we discuss the intersection of faith, generosity, and personal finance. Today we're talking to Bill High, legacy advisor and founder of the Signatry. Bill started the first half of his career in law before leaving to launch what would later become the Signatry, a donor-advised fund platform that connects givers with ministries tackling some of the world's biggest problems. Through his work with the Signatry, Bill developed a passion for seeing individual families united by a clear and driving mission and vision that reflects God's particular calling for them. In recent years, Bill has focused much of his efforts consulting for and guiding families stewarding wealth through some of these considerations, and he had a lot of practical considerations and strategies to share. Before we get started, do you ever wish you could find more people who are passionate about generosity, serving their communities, and advancing the gospel? Well, we have growing community groups on Facebook and LinkedIn where you can do just that. You don't need to have a financial finish line to join. All you need is a passion for glorifying Christ with whatever God's given you to manage. Look for the link in our show notes to learn more. And with that, let's get to the interview. All right, we're here with Bill High today. Bill, thanks so much for joining us today.
Yeah, great to be here.
So why don't you kick us off just telling us a little bit about who you are and maybe some of how your story began, some of your faith background.
Yeah, absolutely. So I tell people that I was one of those kids who grew up on the other side of the tracks, just that both sides of the tracks were pretty bad. So my dad was the oldest of 8, lived in a 3-room log cabin. So as you can imagine, that's a lot of kids for not many rooms. He, hills of the Missouri Ozarks, a very backwoods, hillbilly-ish. My great-grandfather, who I was named after, was a moonshiner. And anyway, that's some of the background. My dad joined the service and was in the Army, stationed in the Korean War, met my mom in Japan, and brought her here back to the United States. They had 6 kids. I was number 5, but very poor background. He was a heavy drinker, smoker, alcoholic, the whole bit. We lived on welfare some. Salvation Army brought us Christmas gifts, the whole bit. So pretty tough background growing up. And we moved quite a bit. In fact, part of my story that sometimes I share is that we had a house fire. In fact, I've got a little artifact here. I say that in your family, you got to have artifacts of culture. And so this is actually from 1969 when our house burned down. I went back a few years ago, actually, and there was still wood from that house that we lived in. And I salvaged some and brought some back. And the house, by the way, was painted white, had a green roof, and had black shutters. So this is one of our artifacts of culture. But that house fire forced us to move from the town that we were living in to a small town by the Missouri River. And in that town, it's a town of 100 people, but somebody decided to plant a church in that town of 100 people. Kind of a dumb idea, isn't it? I mean, why would you plant a church in a town of 100 people? But it turned out that our neighbors 2 doors down from us became believers and started bringing us a children's Bible storybook. And it's really through that church plant and through a few people that from a suburban church that said, let's go plant a church in a town of 100 people. A conversion, neighbors who bring us a children's Bible storybook that I came to know the person of Christ. I was about 7, 8 years old when that happened. It was about, my dad died when I was 12. So there we were, kind of left alone. My mom had 6 kids still to raise. She was from Japan. She didn't speak the English great. She didn't drive a car at that point, didn't have a license, had to get a license and go to work. But God was gracious, as he always is. He's a father to the fatherless and a defender of the widow. And he definitely stepped in on behalf of our family. So that's the beginnings. There you go.
Yeah, thank you, Bill. Can you tell us a little bit about how you started in your early career? How did you get to that point, and what did you decide to do?
Yeah, the fast forward of that story. So here I am, 12 years old. My father's passed away. I had a 7th grade teacher who assigned us the homework assignment of keeping a journal for 30 days. So I still have the journal. So I can go all the way back to 1978. One of my first journal entries was, man, I'd love to have a great family. I'd love to be a father. And I also said, man, I want to work in the urban world. We were living out away from the city, the whole bit. Well, fast forward, I go into high school, and long story short, I become really a very outspoken believer, probably a little abrasive even in high school, one of those guys. But I was acknowledged for my faith in high school. Ended up, again, God was gracious to us, was able to go to school, undergrad, got a degree in education, thought I was going to teach and coach. And then ultimately what happened is I ended up, my last year of college, ended up applying to law school. I had a friend encourage me to go ahead and apply to law school. So I did, ended up getting into law school with a full ride. So it was like God was saying, hey, you ought to go to law school. So I did, ended up practicing law and did that for 12 years. Big law firm at the time when I joined. I mean, 80 lawyers, that put us as one of the top 5 law firms in Kansas City. And that was quite the journey as well. I'd become a partner there, but really had to go through some hard lessons too. I had to go through this whole place of where I realized that my career was not my God and that God had really called me to something. But it was also during the course of that some of the next stage was being set up. So, of course, right before my last year of law school, I got married. So part of that fulfillment of what was beginning to happen, I wanted to have a great family. And then later, as my law career was starting to take a turn, I ended up volunteering with a good friend of mine in urban ministry. And so there you go. I was volunteering in urban ministry. And that's really kind of where the next stage was set up. Because what happened from there is the guys in urban ministry, if you appreciate urban ministry, you don't get your funding from the people that you're working with. You got to go seek it elsewhere. And they came to me and said, we got to find a way to raise money for ministry. And so that's really what led us to the start of creating at that time what was called the Servant Foundation.
Yeah, and I am excited to hear about some of that process. Before that, I'd love to hear, I know generosity has been a big part of your life. Where did you see God start to plant those seeds along some of this story, and how did that kind of weave together?
That's an interesting question. Not a lot of people ask kind of the beginnings of that. But for me, what happened is because I had started out fairly young, becoming a believer, I had an older brother, got involved with the Navigator ministry, came to Christ through the Navigator ministry. And so from the very beginning, I had some pretty good teaching, some pretty good grounding in the word, and understood from the beginning that giving was something that we should be part of. So I remember actually being in college, poor college student. And because of what had happened, I got a check, Social Security survivor benefits. And it just seemed to me that that was not my money. And so I gave it all away. I gave it to my mom, actually. I gave it back to her because she was a widow. She needed money. And so I always gave the whole thing away. You'd think, man, I should probably keep some of that. But, I never did. Now, sometimes that meant that on a Sunday night when they weren't having meals in the residence hall, then I was eating an apple and popcorn. But it was always something that was there. And of the money that I did make, now during college, I was working like 3 jobs at times to make it through. And I still remember that out of the money that I made, I was trying to tithe off that. And so it was a $12 check that I would write to our Navigator ministry guy that I was supporting. I don't know if he actually appreciated that or not, but that $12 was a big deal to me. So that was the beginnings of kind of just trying to be faithful with what God had put in front of us. David Green, who we've had the chance to work with, he always says that if you don't give when you don't have it, you're not going to give when you do. And so I think that was the beginnings of the seeds of it for me.
So, Bill, catch us up on this start of the Servant Foundation. What was the heart behind it, and what do those early days look like?
Yeah, the real heart of what we were doing at the beginning. So keep in mind, we were just a group of guys. So me and my good friend, his name was Emmett Mitchell. He's an African-American guy. He'd been a car dealer. He'd been in banking the whole bit. So he'd been a franchise guy working with GM and Ford the whole bit. But his brother was an inner city ministry guy, but he's also like TV5 news anchor here in Kansas City. So he had a great position, but he'd started to pastor a church in the heart of the inner city. And this guy had a gang member who died like 12 feet from the door of the church. And that was kind of the catalyst to say, I need to go full time doing this ministry. So he stepped out, and then I became the guy that was going to go help him raise some money. So at the very beginning of what we were trying to do, it was how can we advance the gospel? And even from the very beginning, the idea is that, man, if we have this dream of seeing the gospel go out to the last unreached people groups, then we also needed to bring in some of the dollars to make it happen. So sometimes we said, too, that we were trying to connect the doers and the donors, the people out there doing the work and the people that said, man, we want to go fund them. So that was really the vision of what we saw. Sometimes we said it this way, that we wanted to write the last check to reach to the last missionary group to take the gospel to the last unreached people. So that was the thought of where we were at. As we started that, we began to look at other foundation models. So keep in mind, National Christian Foundation been out there, but they were still brand new, relatively speaking. And they hadn't started any affiliates. So we looked at a model with the Leadership Foundation, and that was really a classic fundraising model. We looked at affiliating with the local community foundation here, which was a top 5 foundation in the country. And then we stumbled into meeting the National Christian Foundation folks. So that was our beginnings. But part of the point is we went out and tried to find a solution. NCF was a good solution. I say that because in the history of the National Christian Foundation, they'd actually gone out right at the time we were starting. They were trying to go find other people who could join them in this, what they called the generosity movement. So we came to them and said, hey, help us out, be a back office for us. And so that was really how we began. So it was in October. So I left the law firm in June of 2000. By October of 2000, we actually had signed an agreement and said NCF be our back office. So that was the very beginning. So for about 4 months, I was actually working out of the basement of my home. And then I started but I had to incorporate, get bylaws, a whole bit, get tax exempt status. It was true ground up work. And then I hit the road. I just started going around and meeting people in the community. Didn't really know exactly what I was doing, didn't have a lot of training, but we were off and running. And then by the end of the year, I think we'd opened up from October to December, we opened up 20 some accounts and saw about $6-7 million come in. And I don't know if that was good or not, but NCF sure seemed to think it was. And then, of course, the next year, again, we just continue to see growth on a steady basis year by year over the coming years.
Yeah, it's fun to hear some of that backstory because, we hear about Signatry all the time and NCF, all these names that have been around for a long time now. And it's always fun to hear, when this stuff was just coming into fruition. So tell us a little bit about what you have learned over your time with the Signatry, what you guys figured out in those early days and since then, and kind of how ministry has evolved through that. And even on a personal level, what you've learned about working with people and encouraging generosity.
Yeah, just, a little bit of context in those early days. So by April of 2001, we thought we were ready to become more public in our approach. So we actually invited Ron Blue in. Ron was actually in the process of leaving what is now Ron Blue Trust. So he was our first speaker. And at this big event, we actually sold out, had to go to 2 events, and it was a horrible event. And we ended up being on the top floor of a hotel and the big windows, and we just baked in there. I mean, it was horrible in terms of the logistics, but it was a great kickoff. We ended up having a great kickoff and continued to do events like that. And so in the early days, like any kind of business or nonprofit, you're just trying to figure out how to get the message out there. And we're actually one of the first hosts of a local generous giving conference. We had Hugh McClellan in, Daryl Heald, some of those people. So, we really were on the ground floor of some of the beginnings of that early movement. So we started to see other affiliates come in, the whole bit. But one of the things that changed early on for me, so, we're maybe 5 years into it. And again, still are early on, seeing steady growth. And the generosity thing is really good. But one of the families I was working with happened to be the Hobby Lobby family. They called me and said, hey, we need some help. We're good on the generosity thing, but we don't need a lawyer. We don't need an accountant. Don't need a life insurance guy. Don't need somebody to sell us product. We just need somebody to help us with the family because we're going through transition. We got kids getting married, kids entering the business, in-laws that feel like outlaws, a whole bit. What do we do? And who can help us who doesn't have any kind of those backgrounds? I didn't know who that was. And I knew it wasn't NCF. And I knew we didn't have that skill set at that point in time. So I actually called around and found a guy that had been a psychologist, had done some work with families. And ultimately what happened is they did a little bit of work with the family, but some things didn't go well. And they called me back and said, hey, can you come back and help us out through some of this process? And so I did. I went down, I met with the family. I said, guys, you got a great legal document, but you have a poor legacy document. This is not going to help you govern the family for the next 150 years. So they said, well, who's going to help us? And, it's one of those things where one of those moments like, well, I'll help you. And so I began working with them. Ultimately, that led to other families. And that was part of the big turning point, guys, is that I realized that the generosity conversation, what I thought it had been the conversation, but it was a part of the conversation. Because as we began to work with families, we realized that there was a deeper core issue, which is if I can get my family right, we can ultimately become more generous. And you guys know the stories of people that have businesses and they try to transition wealth. And even a lot of the generosity conversation, what we saw is we saw people that really became more generous. But it was the dad or the mom or maybe them together, but oftentimes they weren't including their kids. And sometimes their kids were a wreck or they sold their business and then they're sitting on the sidelines. And so that began part of the journey for me that was a simultaneous is you got this generosity thing going on and then beginning to work with families. And so that continued to be a theme over the coming years. Now, ultimately, what happened is as we were working with NCF, we were always known as some of the innovators. We were developing things. And by late 2017 is when there became an opportunity for us to step out of the NCF world, not be a franchise or an affiliate in their words, and become independent. So by early 2018, we became our own standalone entity. So that's some of that journey.
Bill, I'd like to dive more into this concept of legacy. And I think you put it very well that generosity is part of the conversation, but there's a lot more to it. Can you share a little more of what other components round out that conversation in your experience?
Yeah, so by, I think it was 2018, we actually stepped out and the consulting work. So the board always allowed me to do some direct consulting work with families. But I realized that if the work was going to scale, we needed to create a different model. So we actually developed a family legacy workshop. And so that family legacy workshop, we did it for the first time in Seattle. And almost immediately, one of the families said, man, this is great. Can you turn this into small group material? Can you actually scale this like a Dave Ramsey kind of model? So that was directionally where we were going is how can we scale it? But the lessons of what we learned, and this is probably one of the things that's made the work that I do particularly unique, is that we've had this direct frontline experience working directly with families and kind of being in the front seat. Again, the generosity seat is good, but to work directly with families, what are the big issues that families face? And so one of the first ones really is, what's the biblical purpose of family? What really is the big idea? And so we ask that question all the time. And, the things that people say is the things that you'd expect. Well, family is a great place of love and support and community and all these kind of things, even a place to teach values. What the Bible defines the family as, it's really looked at as a multi-generational endeavor. It's really the first institution to teach values, to preserve culture on a generational basis. So that's a different kind of idea. We're not taught that. I've led these workshops enough over the years, and I've asked people, have you heard that kind of sermon? And they're like, no, not very often, if at all. So that's one of the big ideas. But the second thing is, if family is really meant to be this multi-generational endeavor, why do we fail? And it's usually typically because of basic communication issues. It's the lack of understanding. Proverbs 24 talks about that by wisdom, a house is built, and by understanding, it's established. By knowledge, the rooms are filled with all precious and pleasant riches. But we just don't understand one another. If you've been married for any length of time, you kind of look over sometimes at your spouse, think, man, what feature is that? Why do we disconnect? And so if you can just understand the basics of communication, and then second, if you can have a process for how you navigate conflict, you got a better chance of succeeding. So those are a couple, but we also know this is a neat thing is that in the scriptures, God gives some very clear things to families about how you should go about what you do. Have a clear vision, have a clear mission, have a clear set of values. In Genesis 15, Abraham's getting a little bit weary because he's been promised a son. He's supposed to have a son. He's going to be given land. He's going to be given a great name, and he's going to bless the world, but he doesn't have a son. So God takes Abram outside in Genesis 15, and he gives him a vision. What does he do? He says, look up at the stars and see if you can count them. That's what I'm going to do with you. So if you can imagine this idea of having that kind of vision going out every night there's a clear night, and say, I'm going to be like that. That's one of the things that you see for successful families is they have a clear vision. They realize what they can become, and it's a generational kind of plan. But anyway, that's where the scriptures go. But we also know the same thing is true in the family office world, family wealth space, is that we have research, we have studies. We know families that are successful for 100, 200 years, 300 years, and there are certain practices, certain behaviors that allow you to succeed from generation to generation. That's a big idea.
Yeah, definitely. And I agree that that's not something that is talked about for as foundational of a concept that is. And, one that touches every single one of us. It's not something that we hear about as much. Maybe you can break down just some of the practical logistics of how a family communicates well, or how a family navigates conflict, or some of these things that you're talking about as far as what a family should be focusing on. How does a family actually go about doing some of those steps?
Well, see, that's where our workshop is. It's like a 6-hour workshop, and you want me to do this in, the next 5 minutes. But, the short of it is you do have to have your foundational principles right. And so the first one you got to answer is, what's the purpose of family biblically? Once you answer that, then the second thing is you just got to understand. We use the acronym SHAPE. Rick Warren talks about this. You got to understand the shape of the people that you're working with, the shape of the people in your family, the spiritual gifts, the heart and passion, abilities, strengths, personality, and life experience. All those things tell us how we fit together. It's the same concept as the church. The hand needs the foot needs the shin, the whole bit. So that's couple your first basic ideas, but you got to have a clear vision, mission, values. Deuteronomy 6 really talks about the idea of repetition. Talk about these things when you get up, when you lie down, when you're walking by the way, pretty much all the time, because we are sheep. We are valuable but stupid. That's the Webster old-time dictionary definition. So the rinse and repeat idea. So you see this in Jewish culture. You really see this throughout the Old Testament. The idea, how many festivals there are in the Bible? How do you celebrate family? 7 festivals. And all those festivals were about was this idea of pull back from work, remember what God has done, which, by the way, one of the other parts of the festivals, go make a gift, sacrifice, make an offering, because that tells you that you're not dependent on your stuff, but you're dependent upon God. And one of the festivals, if you will, is a weekly one, which is Sabbath. Pull back, be with family, have some food, and remember what God's done. So those are some of the basic things that you start looking for in the process of conflict. Some of it's just that. What's the process? The scriptures actually give some clues for what process looks like. My background from being an educator to a lawyer, I'm just big about the idea that if you have the rules of the game written down, you got a better chance for success. And again, we tend to look at Old Testament, New Testament, the New Covenant. And so we tend to dismiss the Old Testament, I'm afraid, in our Western evangelical world. But the Old Testament really, if you will, is like a code of conduct. It's a way of life. Now, there are some things that we say, well, we don't have to go do X and do it exactly that way. But all God was really trying to do is say, guys, if you do what? Honor me and you love one another, the rest of the world will look at you and say, you're pretty different. I wonder if we ought to look at your God. How about that? That was like really quick.
It's a great
There's
summary.
A lot more to talk about, but as I say, in our workshop series, we have kind of this base workshop, and then we have one on conflict, we have one on culture, and then we have one on prodigals, and we're actually developing some more content related to some of the next generation.
So as you're working with a family and you're talking about legacy and multi-generational impact, how do you use your past experience in the generosity space to enter into that conversation with a family specifically?
Well, session 6 of the base workshop actually ends with family generosity. And another way to say that is family generosity is the easiest way to live out vision, mission, values. So you can appreciate that a lot of the families that we work with have adult kids, kids that are in their 20s, or, maybe it's at 13 that acts like that. But you get the point. When you get kids that are adults, it's hard to put the toothpaste back in the tube. But generosity is the great equalizer. So the key to success for families ultimately is, are they meeting regularly as a family, whether meeting is weekly, monthly, quarterly, annually, whatever it is. But the generosity conversation is by far the easiest. If my kids would have come to me, even now and say, hey, we'd like to talk to you about the practice of law, they don't have any experience there. So it's an unequal conversation. If, same thing, you got the guy that's been running a company for 50 years and, they got a 17-year-old that says, Dad, I'd like to talk to you about how you're looking at your financial statements. Now, unless you're dealing with a child prodigy, it's not going to work. But that 17-year-old can come to that 50-year-old dad and say, Dad, I was just at school and I came across this ministry that's doing outreach to abused kids. Could we support that? That's an equal conversation. And that's what you want to do, is you want to level the playing field. And that's the power of the generosity conversation.
So I know you've worked with a lot of families over the years, and we talk a lot about finish lines on the podcast here. I'd be interested to know if you have seen any families who have implemented some kind of a finish line in the course of their life, either in their family or on a broader picture, and how, different ways that you've seen that play out, if you have seen that among some of the families you've worked with.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, the finish line issue is one of the real critical ones, obviously. I mentioned to you kind of pre-call that sometimes I equate this whole finish line idea with the idea of who's the owner. Is God the owner, or are you the owner? And I wrote a book years ago, not necessarily my finance work, but we interviewed a bunch of people from around the country called The Generosity Bet. And it was just stories of people on their generosity journey. And the number one thing that changed people's generosity typically is when they understood the generosity of God, along with the idea that God was the owner and they were not. Because when they understood that God was the owner, that allowed them to say, it's not mine, it's all yours. And so all I need to do is figure out how I have enough for my family, my life, etc. But it changed the finish line. Let's put it in a different way, because now the finish line really became this idea of, well, do we still have people who don't know Christ? And as long as we have people who don't know Christ, I need to be motivated by that finish line, that every tribe and every nation would hear the gospel. So it's easier for me to say, you know what, I've got enough. And so I need to challenge myself to continue to be more generous because that finish line is not done. Does that make sense, guys?
Yeah.
So I think that's a powerful idea to think of it that way, the two finish lines.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And I think that's something that we have kind of been exploring just from hearing from all kinds of different people around these concepts of generosity and how, like you talked about, connecting doers to donors. And that's such a rich, deep conversation. And to think of a personal financial finish line and then kind of picking up your head and seeing the capital C church, the global church, has this kind of universal finish line, the completion of the Great Commission. And I like how you can break it into digestible pieces, if you will. What would it look like to get the Bible translated into every language? What would it look like to get churches planted in these communities? You can start to set these finish lines as a family, as a community, as a church.
But that's where if you tie it back into this idea, and this is why the family becomes so important, family, vision, mission, values, going back to the idea of Genesis 1, what was the original mandate that God gave the very first family? Go make the world more beautiful, more creative. And so if we can say, hey, guys, what has God called your family to? Where are you going to plant the flag? What's your finish line? Are you going to be part of XYZ effort to close out the gospel or get the Bible translated in this language? Or maybe it's, the homeless in your community till we eradicate homelessness in our community. Those are the kind of things that if you change that as your finish line, it makes what you have far less important. And that's a big mindset shift. So you asked that question, by the way. Let me go and throw this in there. So the Hobby Lobby is kind of a classic story, of course, of finish line, if you will. Now, David Green would say, I'm not Alan Barnhart. I drive nice cars, all that kind of stuff. But, he hasn't had a raise in 15 years or something like that. He says, I'm okay. And they give 50% away of their profit. And I'll typically ask David, I'll say, we do these CEO events with David, and we bring in CEOs from around the country, different leaders. We've been doing this for like 15 years, and people still come. In fact, last couple of weeks ago, we brought in a group from Australia, Singapore, New Zealand, Colombia. People want to come hear the story, but there's this moment where David talks about, we grew to this place where we're going to give 50% of our profit away. And I'm thinking, I asked him the question, I'm like, David, this is crazy. You're sitting here as a company that's incredibly profitable, nearly $8 billion in sales. And it would be easy to rationalize and say, we could do more stores. We could buy more real estate, we could grow the portfolio, we could have more cash reserves, lots of the ways you could rationalize not doing this. And in fact, you could go further and say, if you're going to be spending on yourself, is like, go buy an island or go buy a country, a small country. And why give 50%? And really simply, he says, because I'm content. There's nothing that this world has that I want. But he's the one that says this really well. He's like, as long as there are people who don't know Jesus, I want to make as much money as I can and give as much money as I can until that finish line is done.
That's a pretty powerful story. And I'm sure that you've seen many iterations of that among some of the families that you worked with. I'd love to hear if there are any stories, and you don't have to share names, but where you have seen a family go through some of this process of trying to work through some of this vision, mission, values, and how that has united the family towards a united purpose of some kind.
Yeah. Well, let me say too, first, there are certainly plenty of failures too. I think I've got a book right behind me on the wall that's about how the great philanthropists have failed. And generally, that's been one of the ongoing themes is the failure is greater than the successes. And you've heard the adage, shirt sleeves is shirt sleeves in 3 generations. And while that's not 100% that it's going to be by the third generation, that proverb is in virtually every country in the world. And generally speaking, it's true that most people don't succeed in transferring financial wealth, let alone their values, very well down from one generation to the next. So we've seen a lot of failures historically and otherwise, but there are successes. And one of the best stories, frankly, isn't necessarily a family of wealth, but we did a beta small group where we took some young families through our materials and they crafted their own vision, mission, values. I got one here on the wall. This is our family. And so this is us. And so here it is, vision, mission, values, disciples everywhere for generations. That's our vision statement. But this family did the same thing. And they're like, hey, we're going to put this up on the wall of our home. They added their code of conduct, and it's, well, the wall of their apartment. Okay. And when they started, they weren't even engaged yet. They got engaged, they got married, and then they ultimately came to a place where God moved on them. It's like, we're sensing God's moving. And so they ended up with a inner city ministry. But when they were going to go make this decision about whether they should join that ministry, they asked the ministry and they said, hey, what are your vision, mission, values? And the ministry said, well, it's this, and this, and this. And so they pulled out theirs and said, looks like we have a match. And the ministry looks at them and says, we've never had anybody do that. And that's a great example about how when you get this right, you make better decisions.
Yeah, Bill, that is a really cool example. I think having clarity around what your mission and vision is as a family, it's not something I've heard about a whole lot, but it really does clarify the kind of decisions that you make into what you're giving to, how you're spending your time, how you spend your career. I think it influences all kinds of different important pivotal decisions in a family. And I imagine that leads to a higher success rate for kind of intergenerational values being transferred as well.
Oh, yeah, 100%. I mean, again, if you go into the secular world, the family wealth world, there's a guy named Dennis Jaffe. He's a PhD guy. He's written some stuff on the 100-year family. And so, again, the statistical research says that for families who have a clear and articulated vision, mission, value statement, they have a greater chance of success to be the 100-year family if it is affirmed and reaffirmed from generation to generation. That's a big deal. But you have to be able to affirm it and reaffirm it. But you got to have the clarity around what it is. Unfortunately, the comparison in the Western world is, in the Western world, what we talk about is what values are caught, not taught. And we kind of get all proud about that. Like, I'm going to be a good role model, so I'm not going to teach, I'm just going to live it. Well, the reality is that's only partially true. If you don't ever teach your kids your values, you get this generational drift. It's like, oh yeah, I kind of knew they were people of faith. Or it's the same thing, conversations about money and giving. If you never talk about it, well, kind of saw them, throw a check in the offering plate kind of deal. You got to talk about it. It's the whole Matthew 6 principle, we always use that. Don't let your left hand know what your right hand's doing. That's a motivation question. It's not that you don't talk about your giving. It's what your motive is. In the same passage, it talks about prayer and fasting. Again, it's not the idea that, hey, we're not going to talk about it. We're just not going to use it to lift ourselves up. And so that's why this becomes such a critical endeavor. But if you know and create the space for a family to say, we're really called to something, and we're going to put our time and our money and our efforts behind XYZ effort, it begins to clarify how that family can go forward from generation to generation. I mean, think about it logically, guys, by the way. what's an easier deal in the whole values caught, not taught kind of idea? We tend to say, okay, we're going to ship our kids off to school, or we're going to ship them off to Sunday school if they even have that, or we're going to ship them off. We delegate all of this activity, and then we kind of expect them to wander a little bit till we say, what? They're going to own their faith. And oftentimes they own their faith in college. Man, that's a crapshoot. To hope some college ministry shows up at their door and then all of a sudden they have a real ownership of their faith. That's not God's design for the family. It's not his design for his people. His design is that from the very beginning, we would talk about the things that would matter to our kids, because then you got a greater chance that they'll live it out.
Yeah, and I loved what you were saying about the Old Testament, just the family structure and the rhythms of life in that Old Testament culture drove that in so hard. The repetition, the reminders throughout just normal family life. I love that story about the family whose mission, vision, and values matched up with that ministry so well. And obviously, having clarified as a family those three aspects of what your family is all about really helped in the generosity discussion as well, in terms of where are you going to put your effort behind or really lean into? For families that have ironed out what some of that looks like in terms of vision, mission, values, but really haven't quite figured out what they feel called to in terms of a cause or, something specific, do you have any guidance for families who are kind of at that stage where they can find that kind of a match?
Well, one of the first things, let's come back to kind of some really basics. Local church should be your first priority. Okay. So let's start there. Because if we're not starting there, then we're really not starting with the base. There's 3 tithes in the Old Testament. It's the Levitical tithe, the festival tithe, and those are really church-based, if you will, and then a tithe for the poor and needy. So it's the 3rd tithe where we're starting to look out, but the first couple tithes are really to say, how do we help build the house of God? So the second thing that we say in that is go to your pastor or pastors and say, man, where do you need help? How can I help you? What are some of the things that you're thinking about or that are missions and ministries of the church that I can be part of? And maybe you need to be the family that says, every kid that wants to go on a summer mission trip, I'll match 50% or whatever that number is. But I'm just going to be that family. Or when you have that benevolence, could I be on the benevolence and help those families that are in need? Just start with some of those kind of basics like that, where you can be really helpful. And it's that separation of saying, I'm not just given to the building or the institution, which is a lot of people distrust, but now you're going to that pastoral world and saying, tell me where some of the needs are. And let me tell you, if you want to get a pastor excited about somebody that cares about the mission and ministry of the church, that's a great place to start. So from there, once we're saying, okay, we're taking care of the house of God, then you actually go back and you start to look and say, hey, what are my values? So let's give according to our values. So we typically say, one of your values should be an upward value, whether it's God first, and maybe there's a relational or family value. And then the third thing that you look at related to that, so you're looking upward, you're looking relationally, but then you look at your life experience. What are the experiences that God has given you that have taught you lessons? The oldest Green family member, Mark Green, he says it this way. He says, wherever your deepest wound is where the flower grows. So God has given each one of us experiences that is maybe the place where he wants to meet us at in terms of our ministry. So whether that's the person that just had a tough family life and says, man, I'm going to be the person that wants to support family-oriented ministries. So the whole single parenting thing, I grew up with that. So that's always been part of our ministry as a family. The idea of collegiate ministry, that was a big deal for us. So look at your life experiences and say, here's some things that God has called me to. And then over and above that, be a little crazy, be a little radical, just respond to some of those things in the moment. Have you guys heard of the book, The 10-Second Rule? Probably heard of that. No?
No.
It's the idea that sometimes God nudges you, Well, don't rationalize it away.
Mm-hmm.
And usually what happens if you get past 10 seconds, you're like, oh no, what would happen if I gave that guy 10, he's just going to go buy some whiskey, or if I do that ministry, they don't need me. We just need to say yes a little bit more.
So, Bill, how do you navigate the conversation around wealth transfer when you have families that might have a lot of members and maybe the parents who were generators of wealth, for example, have a bunch of kids and they are kind of living a variety of different kinds of lives? How does the parents navigate that conversation with the kids and make decisions around actual wealth transfer?
Yeah. So on the consulting side, so our consulting company is 7-generation legacy. And so one, again, you're starting with this idea, you're supposed to be a generational family. All right. So you start with that kind of concept. But from there, you want to be able to go is when we talk about wealth transfer, the biggest wealth transfer issue is to not transfer wealth consumption, but to transfer wealth creation. So what we're hoping for is that we will transfer the idea that you have a responsibility to future generations. You are stewarding an asset for the generations to come. And as a result of that, we're not saying, look, here's your $1 billion estate or $1 million estate. It's here's what are we going to give to you so you can go consume it. What we're trying to pass on to you, if we're going to pass on financial wealth, the idea is that we want to be able to pass it on to you so you will create more. So you will live out the Genesis mandate, make the world more beautiful and more creative for God's kingdom. That's how we look at wealth transfer. You got to ask yourself, man, are those kids ready? But back up, a little bit of other point on this I think is worthy to recover. There's the notion today of 3 ways that you handle wealth transfer or an asset. So let's say you got a business. So the first mindset in the Western world is we build things to sell. Okay. So we start it, we grow it, boom, we sell it. We got a nest egg, and then we're going to go retire and play golf. And then that's one model. Okay. Very prevalent. And again, in the US, we don't have much of a model of continuity, the 200-year kind of business. So that's one model. The downside of that model is you end up with a cash and maybe you end up sitting on your can a whole bunch. And we didn't teach our kids anything. And we lose the culture of the company. We lose the generosity, all that bit. So that's one model. The second model is that you build a split. And this is usually by default. It's like, okay, built this big business, and then the guy walks in on the tax issue. Man, if you don't split this thing up, you're just going to have a massive estate tax. So what you actually end up doing is say, well, I'm going to give this much to the kids, and maybe I'll give away some kind of stuff. But the build the split model, the problem is if you haven't prepared the kids, you're probably going to build it to fail. The third model about how do you build to sustain, that build to sustain model says, let's look at our resources as owned by God and we're to steward them. So if I am passing on financial wealth to you, not just, again, other forms of wealth, intellectual, social, spiritual, emotional, if I'm passing on those others, we're great. But if we're going to pass on the financial wealth, can I give it to you guys and say, all right, now what are you going to do with it? What real estate are you going to go buy so we can create housing for others? Or, those are the kind of questions. So it's a different kind of question, but that assumes that we're preparing the next generation, which we tend not to do very well.
And what are your thoughts on the timing of wealth transfer? Because I think just the idea of transfer after the first generation has passed is a pretty simple model. But, it's often a lot more complex than that. What kind of models have you seen in terms of wealth transfer in the context of also of all these things that you're talking about here?
Well, again, if you broaden the definition of wealth transfer, in the Jewish model of education, you started when the kids were born, even in the womb. And from 0 to 5, you did 2 things. You taught them the Shema, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one. And then you taught them the biblical stories. So that's the beginnings of wealth transfer, right? So let's kind of reset that conversation. But then the next stage of education in the life of kids oftentimes was built around this idea of let's begin to understand the law. And for those that were really advanced, and they might go on and actually be under a rabbi who had authority. But in that next stage, teaching of the law, what are you teaching? Well, one of the things that you're teaching is that, where does wealth come from? It comes from God. He's the one that helps you create it. It's not from you. So you're talking in that 12, 13 age range. You're starting to get a little deeper in those kind of things. In the idea of financial wealth transfer, that's actually kind of the same thing that we're talking about, is that, in that age 10, 12, 13, teen years, you're starting to actually begin saying, we're going to start involving the kids now. Now, on the giving side, by the way, you can start even younger than that. Age 5, age 6, where you're starting to teach them how to be givers. But again, moving forward a little bit in the financial wealth transfer side of what we talk about, later in high school, you should start to be having some of those financial discussions. There's a Young Americans Bank that has a financial literacy program that actually says, by even age 7, we might be talking to them about savings and budgeting. And then you move up a little bit and you're talking about, here's what a financial statement is. Here's what stocks are. Late high school, we're starting to actually talk about investing. We're going to do some investing together. I've got one family office guy that says their goal is by age 21, they're going to do a complete full financial reveal. They're going to know everything. There is a guy that has written a book. I forget which author it is, but it's all about entitlement. He's a lawyer, and he's like, I don't want to tell anybody anything. And I don't actually think that helps. I think you've actually got to invite people in. One of the stages of J.H. Ranch says there's 4 big stages of parenting. 0 to 5 is the caretaker. You got to make sure your kids are fed the whole bit. The 5 to 10 is the cop stage. Don't run across the street or you're going to get hit by a car, kind of stuff. A lot of don'ts in that stage. The next phase, 10 to 18, is a lot of coaching. You're standing on the sidelines watching now. And 18 plus is consulting. I actually think the better term is partnership. And so if you're inviting your kids in to be wealth creators because the family has a vision, you want to share that with them. So that's a different kind of model.
Well, Bill, I'm really excited about the work that you're doing. I think it is really important, and it's not an area that I've heard a lot about elsewhere. So I just really appreciate you saying I can meet that need back when the family legacy conversation started and that work started in your life. And just the conclusions that you're able to draw from that, I can feel all the ideas kicking around in my head even now. But when you think about the future, what are you most excited about over the next 5 to 10 years?
Well, we started off some of this discussion starting about the charitable foundation world and, starting out with NCF and then stepping out as a Signatry. So it's almost been, 18 months. And I stepped out of the Signatry world. The generosity world was a ton of fun. But I realized there was this great opportunity to impact families that would be generational in nature, culture shifting, and that the trajectory of families around the globe could change. And that's actually what's really getting me excited is there's this global opportunity to change the conversation around the biblical idea of what family is. And if people get that idea of this responsibility that we have, that family is meant to be generational in nature. And by the way, it's not just family. It's single people too. I mean, you look at, we don't know if Daniel was married, by the way. Maybe he was. Jeremiah certainly wasn't married. God uses the lives of people to impact the generations. It may be in the context of a family, but you all come from a family, and your family, whether you're single or married, can impact the generation. So this big idea that you have a generational opportunity, and you see this again in the scriptures about how God sometimes doesn't fulfill his promise for generations to come. And so if people understand this idea, I truly think that we can have this great revolution As long as Jesus tarries, I think we can have this great revolution in the idea of what family really is. And I also think that we can see the greatest wealth creation, the greatest generosity ever in the history of the world. I mean, it is one of the greatest periods in time in the history of the world in terms of the amount of wealth that could transfer. But if we saw that as our responsibility, already this year we've been Australia, Costa Rica, the Philippines, Singapore, Malaysia. The global family's getting this idea. We just did a digital workshop today, or past couple days. We had somebody from Trinidad. We had somebody from Finland. We've had people from Hawaii. There are people, from the Philippines who want to be in. The time zone differences are real, but regardless, that stuff gets me excited because when we talk about the whole idea of finish line and the idea that there are people who don't know, and we see people that would say, I'm going to own that. I'm going to own that nation. Or I'm going to own that gospel translation or, the book of, Ruth or whatever it is. Their idea that they're going to say, let's own these things so we can keep advancing the mission. That's the kind of stuff that really gets me pumped up.
Yeah, absolutely. And, it just keeps reminding me back to what you said really early on in this conversation about Abraham and that vision that God gave him and just how that has played out over the last couple thousand years of building something from something small and doing it through family. So this has certainly got me thinking about a whole lot of different things. I still have a pretty young family, just thinking through some of those ages that you were talking about, thinking about what I can be doing with my girls and trying to kind of shepherd them into our family culture. So I'm excited about a lot of what you're doing, and I hope that it continues to expand and grow from here. I want to leave some time for our manager's minute as we get to the end of the episode here. And we like to end every episode with just a practical action our listeners can take to step into their role as stewards and manage God's wealth wisely. So, Bill, do you have a suggestion for our listeners today?
Well, let me be practical too. We certainly encourage people to attend a workshop. LegacyStone.com is the ministry side of what we do, but we'd encourage people to come in and attend a workshop. We do them digitally as well, but it's a way for people to get grounded. So when you talk about the manager's minute kind of idea, let me kind of just wrap up some of this conversation with these couple ideas. It's this idea that first, I think we should always feel some tension with our own generosity, the lives that we're living. Am I keeping enough? Am I giving enough? And if we're not feeling some stress, or maybe stress isn't the right word, but some tension around, man, am I being challenged? Maybe we're not in the right place. So that's one key point. But then the second key point that I would say is that if people would embrace this idea, Psalm 78 verses 5-7 really talks about how one generation should transfer God's story, his code from one generation to the next, so that people would know, put their trust in God. That's one of those big ideas, that if we would just embrace that idea of the generational responsibility, it takes some weight off the present moment and our needs and wants of this day and age. So those are a couple things I'd say.
Yeah, absolutely. And if somebody wanted to get in touch with you guys or learn more, where can they find some more information?
Well, they certainly feel free to shoot me an email. So how about this email? High, H-I-G-H at legacystone.com. And then the website, legacystone.com, they can see where we're hosting some of these workshops. Now, the workshops that we do digitally are by invitation. So if people want to come and participate in that way, that's great. But that's our great hope and desires, that we'll continue to see this community of families that say, man, we're trying to live out, the vision that God has for us, live it out every single day with a clear set of values, so that we can gather together as families, whether it's in church or in conferences and otherwise, and say, let's go get this thing figured out.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for joining us, Bill. This has been a fantastic conversation, certainly eye-opening in many levels, and just appreciate all that you have learned and how you have grown over the years, and your generosity in sharing that with us tonight.
Yeah. Thanks so much, guys. Thanks for having me on.
Hey, thanks so much for listening to the show, guys. If you want to find any references or links from today's show, you can always find them in our show notes at finishlinepledge.com/episode 103. Before we finish up, I have a quick question for you. Have you ever stopped to answer the question, how much is enough? A financial finish line is designed to help you do just that. Our 90-day Finish Line Pledge breaks down the process into 3 easy steps. Step 1, define how much is enough for you and your family to spend in a single month and use that as your monthly spending budget for 90 days. Step 2, as God provides money to manage, set aside any margin outside of your finish line into a separate bank account. Step 3, after 90 days, explore the many ways you can use the margin you've set aside to create joy, purpose, and impact in God's kingdom. Want to learn more? Check out our website at finishlinepledge.com. That's all we have for today. We'll see you next time.